At my sister's wedding, her father-in-law raised his glass and said, "I just hope this marriage brings stability to your family." God knows she didn't get that from him. I stood up and asked, "Do you even know who I am?" The words came out calm and cold, cutting through the champagne-soaked air like a blade through silk. The ballroom went completely silent. 147 guests turned their eyes toward our table, their conversations dying mid-sentence. Harold Caldwell's face drained of color, as he realized he'd just made the biggest mistake of his privileged life. My sister Mia froze beside her new husband Grant, her bouquet trembling in her hands. She knew what was coming. She knew I wouldn't let this slide. The rage hit me first, a white-hot surge that made my vision blur at the edges. This pompous bastard had just publicly humiliated me at my sister's wedding, suggesting I was somehow unfit, unstable, a liability to his precious family name. The audacity was breathtaking. Here was a man who'd never worked a day of real labor in his life, who'd inherited his wealth and spent it on maintaining appearances, questioning my character in front of everyone who mattered to Mia. But then something else kicked in, something colder and far more dangerous. My analytical mind engaged, the same strategic thinking that had built my business empire from nothing. Harold Caldwell had just declared war on me in the most public way possible. He'd chosen this moment, this sacred day, to try to diminish me. That wasn't just cruelty, it was stupid. And I was about to show him exactly how stupid. I took a breath and let the silence stretch, watching him squirm. The tactical part of my brain was already spinning up contingencies, analyzing weaknesses, identifying pressure points. Harold didn't know it yet, but he'd just picked a fight with someone who specialized in dismantling overconfident men like him, someone who had resources, connections, and most importantly, the patience to destroy him methodically. The wedding guests were getting uncomfortable now, shifting in their seats, waiting to see what would happen next. Mia's eyes darted between Harold and me, her expression pleading for me not to make a scene. But Harold had already made the scene. I was just going to finish it. I needed context here, needed these people to understand exactly who they were dealing with. So I started from the beginning, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. When Mia was 8 years old and I was 18, our mother died of a heroin overdose in the next room while we slept. I found her in the morning, cold and blue, needle still in her arm. I could have let the state take Mia. Instead, I lied to social workers, forged documents, and became her guardian. I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat: night security at a warehouse, weekend construction, and morning shifts at a coffee shop before high school. I never went to college. While my classmates were pledging fraternities and discovering themselves, I was helping Mia with homework and making sure she had clean clothes for school. I wanted her to have the childhood I never got, so I stayed hard while keeping her life soft. Ballet lessons, birthday parties with her friends, orthodontist appointments, summer camps. I made it all happen on a security guard's salary, because she deserved better than what life had handed us. But here's what Harold didn't know about the broke 18-year-old who raised his daughter-in-law. I was paying attention. Every successful person who came through that warehouse, every business conversation I overheard during those long night shifts, every financial magazine I read during breaks, I was building a foundation. By 22, I'd saved enough to buy my first rental property, a rundown duplex in Southie that I renovated myself on weekends. That duplex became 2 properties. 2 became 4. By 30, I owned 47 rental units across Boston and Cambridge. But real estate was just the foundation. I'd been studying the market, learning about inefficiencies, identifying opportunities that bigger players overlooked. When the tech boom hit Boston, I was ready. My current portfolio includes 68 rental properties worth approximately $12 million, controlling interests in 4 different companies, and liquid investments totaling another $8 million. My annual income last year was $2.3 million. The Italian leather shoes Harold had mocked cost more than most people's monthly rent, and I owned 12 pairs in different colors. More importantly than money, though, I had something Harold Caldwell had never possessed. I'd earned my position through intelligence and persistence rather than inheritance. I understood how business really worked from the ground up. I knew how to identify weaknesses in overextended companies, how to trace cash flow problems, how to find pressure points in seemingly stable operations. And I had connections, real connections, not the country club handshake deals that men like Harold relied on, federal judges who remembered when I'd helped fund legal aid clinics, business reporters who trusted me as a reliable source on Boston real estate trends, SEC investigators who'd worked with me on previous fraud cases I'd uncovered, bank presidents who'd watched me turn a duplex into an empire and wanted my business. Harold Caldwell looked successful in his tailored suit and family estate, but I'd already done my research on him. His companies were leveraged beyond reasonable limits, his cash flow was dependent on several high-risk ventures, and his personal finances were surprisingly precarious for someone who lived so ostentatiously. He was exactly the kind of target I'd learned to identify and exploit over the years. The first time I'd met Harold was 6 months ago, when Mia invited me to dinner at the Caldwell family estate in Beacon Hill. The house was impressive, 4 stories of 19th century architecture, with original hardwood floors and oil paintings of dead Caldwells lining the hallways. Harold had made a point of showing me around, emphasizing the family history, the generations of success, the importance of maintaining standards. He'd looked at me like I was contaminating his pristine environment, studying my appearance with obvious disdain. When he asked what I did for work, his tone suggested he already knew I wasn't in his social league. I'd told him simply that I owned several companies. His response, "Ah, a self-starter, that explains the shoes," had been delivered with a smirk that made clear his assessment of my worth. I hadn't responded then because I'd been focused on Mia's happiness. She was glowing that night, excited about Grant, eager for the families to get along. I'd swallowed Harold's condescension for her sake, but I'd also filed it away for future reference. The second encounter had been different. Mia had shown up at my office in tears 2 weeks ago, telling me that Harold had cornered her at lunch and suggested she reconsider the wedding arrangements. Specifically, he'd told her that having me walk her down the aisle would lower the tone of the ceremony and might reflect poorly on the Caldwell family name. He'd suggested she ask our Uncle Robert instead, since he was a bank manager and would present better optics. That's when I'd decided Harold needed to learn some lessons about family loyalty and respect. I'd started making phone calls. My first call was to Jennifer Blake, a forensic accountant who specialized in corporate fraud investigations. Jennifer had worked with me 3 years earlier when I'd uncovered embezzlement at one of my property management companies. She was thorough, discreet, and had connections throughout Boston's financial oversight community. Within 48 hours, Jennifer had provided me with a comprehensive analysis of Harold's business operations. Caldwell Industries was indeed overextended, with debt service consuming nearly 70% of revenue. 3 of his major contracts were with companies that had their own financial stability issues. Most interesting, Harold had been using creative accounting to inflate his company's apparent profitability, techniques that weren't illegal but would cause serious problems if subjected to regulatory scrutiny. My second call was to David Foster, an investigative journalist at the Boston Globe who'd built his reputation exposing corporate corruption. David and I had developed a relationship over the years, as he'd often called me for comment on real estate market trends. More importantly, David had been investigating several companies in Harold's industry and was already familiar with some of the questionable practices Jennifer had identified. The conversation with David was illuminating. He'd been tracking a pattern of bid manipulation and contractor kickbacks in Harold's sector, but hadn't yet focused on Caldwell Industries specifically. When I provided him with Jennifer's preliminary findings, he became very interested in digging deeper. We agreed that any story would need to be exhaustively researched and bulletproof, but David felt confident he could build a compelling case if the evidence supported it. My third strategic move was reaching out to Rebecca Stone, a former SEC investigator who now ran her own compliance consulting firm. Rebecca had helped me structure several of my business acquisitions to ensure regulatory compliance, and she understood the nuances of financial oversight better than almost anyone in Boston. Rebecca's analysis was particularly valuable because she could predict how regulatory agencies would respond to specific types of violations. After reviewing Jennifer's findings, she confirmed that Harold's accounting practices, while creative, crossed several lines that would trigger automatic investigations if brought to the SEC's attention. More importantly, she identified 3 specific areas where Harold's companies had likely violated federal contracting regulations. Armed with this intelligence, I developed a 3-phase strategy. Phase 1 involved documenting everything thoroughly and establishing a clear legal foundation. Phase 2 would be applying pressure through multiple channels simultaneously. Phase 3 would be public exposure timed for maximum impact. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and Harold could potentially address the issues before they became critical. Too late, and the wedding would be over, reducing the symbolic impact. I needed Harold to understand that his humiliation of me had consequences, but more importantly, I needed him to understand that he'd chosen to attack someone far more dangerous than he'd realized. I'd spent the week leading up to the wedding making final preparations. David had completed his investigation and written a comprehensive expose documenting Harold's questionable business practices, contractor relationship irregularities, and creative accounting methods. The story was fact-checked, legally reviewed, and ready for publication on my signal. Rebecca had filed formal complaints with 3 separate regulatory agencies, each focusing on different aspects of Harold's operations. The complaints were detailed, well documented, and would trigger automatic investigations regardless of their ultimate outcomes. She'd structured them to become active simultaneously, creating a cascade of regulatory scrutiny that would be impossible for Harold to manage quietly. Jennifer had prepared a forensic analysis that could be shared with Harold's business partners, major clients, and financial institutions. The analysis didn't make accusations, but simply presented his financial practices in clear terms that would raise serious questions about risk assessment and due diligence. I'd also spent considerable time planning my responses to various scenarios. Harold might try to apologize, might attempt to escalate the conflict, might seek to negotiate, or might simply try to minimize the damage. I had contingencies prepared for each possibility, designed to ensure that any response from him would only make his situation worse. The wedding toast was perfect timing. Harold had chosen to humiliate me publicly, creating the ideal opportunity for me to respond in kind. The 147 guests included his business associates, social connections, potential clients, and family members. Everyone who mattered to Harold's professional and personal life would witness his destruction. Now, standing in that silent ballroom, I was ready to implement Phase 2. I looked directly at Harold as I continued my story, watching his confidence evaporate as he began to understand the scope of his miscalculation. "I'm the reason Mia didn't end up in foster care, Harold. I'm also the reason your company is about to face federal investigation." Right on cue, Harold's phone buzzed. The timing was perfect. David had published his article exactly when we'd planned. Harold glanced at his phone, and his face went completely white. The Boston Globe's headline was devastating. "Local contractor under investigation for bid manipulation and financial irregularities." A gasp rippled through the ballroom as guests checked their own phones and saw the story spreading across social media. Harold tried to speak, but I raised my hand to cut him off. "You've embarrassed yourself enough," I said calmly. The consequences came faster than even I had anticipated. Harold's phone started ringing continuously as business partners, clients, and board members saw the story and demanded explanations. His wife grabbed his arm, her face pale with shock and confusion. Grant stood frozen beside Mia, clearly unable to process how his father's toast had triggered this catastrophe. I turned to Mia and offered her my arm. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she took my arm without hesitation. We walked down the aisle together, not to wedding music, but to complete silence except for the continuous buzzing of Harold's phone and the whispered conversations of guests frantically checking the news. The ceremony continued, but Harold's destruction dominated everything. By the time Mia and Grant exchanged vows, 3 of Harold's major clients had already released statements distancing themselves from Caldwell Industries, pending the outcome of investigations. His company's stock price had dropped 18% in after-hours trading. The following week brought a cascade of consequences that exceeded even my strategic projections. The SEC investigation proceeded rapidly, aided by the comprehensive documentation Rebecca had provided. Harold's creative accounting practices, when subjected to federal scrutiny, revealed several clear violations of financial reporting requirements. The agency froze his company's assets pending resolution of the investigation. 2 major clients terminated their contracts with Caldwell Industries, citing reputational concerns and contractual clauses about regulatory compliance. Harold's primary lender called in several loans that had personal guarantees attached, forcing him to liquidate personal assets, including the family estate, that had impressed me so much during our first meeting. The Massachusetts Attorney General's office launched its own investigation into the bid manipulation allegations, focusing on several state contracts Harold's company had won over the previous 5 years. The investigation revealed a pattern of collusion with other contractors that had inflated project costs and shortchanged taxpayers. Harold's board of directors requested his resignation within 10 days of the Globe story publication. His replacement was announced simultaneously with news that the company was filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Harold's personal financial guarantees made him liable for millions in corporate debt, ensuring that his personal bankruptcy would follow shortly. Most satisfying was watching Harold's social circle abandon him completely. The country club revoked his membership. The charity boards removed him from leadership positions. Former business associates stopped returning his calls. The same social connections he'd been so eager to protect from association with me now wanted nothing to do with him. Mia and Grant had to postpone their honeymoon to Italy while dealing with the family crisis, but they weathered the storm together. Grant, to his credit, supported Mia completely and never blamed me for his father's downfall. He understood that Harold had brought this on himself through years of questionable practices and immediate arrogance. 6 months later, Harold Caldwell was working as a mid-level project manager for a small construction firm in Worcester, having lost his house, his business, his social position, and his reputation. His wife Eleanor had divorced him and moved in with her sister in Florida. He was facing potential criminal charges related to the bid manipulation investigation and owed more in legal fees than he could possibly repay. Jennifer Blake continued her forensic accounting practice and became one of the most sought-after experts in corporate fraud investigation in New England. David Foster won a Pulitzer Prize nomination for his investigative series on construction industry corruption. Rebecca Stone expanded her compliance consulting firm and now works with federal agencies on major fraud cases. I continued expanding my business empire, using the publicity from the Harold situation to establish my reputation as someone who couldn't be intimidated or dismissed. 3 new investment opportunities came my way from people who'd witnessed Harold's destruction and wanted to be on my side rather than opposing me. Mia thrived in her marriage, free from Harold's toxic influence and manipulative attempts to control her relationship with me. She and Grant bought a house near my office, and we had dinner together every Sunday. She never again had to choose between her family loyalty and her husband's family acceptance because Harold Caldwell was no longer in a position to make demands. The wedding toast that was supposed to humiliate me instead became the catalyst for Harold's complete destruction. He'd chosen to attack my character publicly, not realizing he was challenging someone with superior resources, strategic thinking, and professional connections. His arrogance cost him everything he'd spent decades building. The lesson was simple. Respect isn't negotiable, and consequences for disrespect can be devastating when you choose the wrong target. Harold learned that family loyalty isn't weakness and that some fights aren't worth starting. I learned that strategic patience and methodical preparation can turn any attack into an opportunity for total victory.